Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a pretty big topic, atheism. We've got this text, atheism.txt, as our guide, and our mission is really to understand what it means to lack belief in gods.
Exactly.
Whether you've thought a lot about this before or maybe you're just curious now, we're hoping to give you a clear, maybe even surprising overview.
Yeah, because it's not just a simple yes or no to God, is it?
Not at all.
Our sources really dig into the history, the different ways people define atheism, the arguments, how it's seen globally. It's think of it as a quick way to get up to speed.
Right. And like you said, it's more complex than just no God. We'll look at how it ranges from, simply not believing to actively saying no gods exist. And we're going on a bit of a historical journey too, right? From ancient times up to today.
A long journey, yeah.
And touching on that fascinating question, do you actually need religion to be moral? Okay, let's get into it.
Let's start with the basics. What is atheism? At its broadest, it's the absence of belief in deities.
Absence of belief.
Okay, but that sounds simple, but it covers a lot. It could be someone who hasn't really thought about gods much, or someone who's actively rejected the idea.
Right, so it's a big umbrella. And the source breaks it down more, doesn't it?
It does. You've got the rejection of belief in deities, and then the even stronger claim that no deities actually exist.
Okay, so like a spectrum. From just not being convinced to actively disagreeing to saying, nope, nothing there.
Exactly. And it helps to think about the opposite, theism. That's the belief that at least one deity exists.
But even defining deity or God can be tricky, can it?
Absolutely. That adds another layer. Are we talking about a God, like the Christian God, or all gods, or just any supernatural being? It complicates things.
Yeah, I can see that. Which brings us to this distinction the text makes between implicit and explicit atheism. What's that about?
So implicit atheism is basically not believing in gods without consciously rejecting the idea.
Like a baby.
Like a newborn, exactly. Baron Dolbach said it way back in 1772. All children are born atheists. They have no idea of God.
Huh. Interesting quote.
And George H. Smith made a similar point about people who've just never encountered the idea of theism. They haven't rejected it. They just don't hold the belief.
So under that very broad definition, lots of people who wouldn't call themselves atheists might technically fit.
That's the key point, yeah. Then you have explicit atheism. That's a conscious choice. Someone's considered the idea of gods and decided, no, I don't believe.
Okay, makes sense. And within that, there's another split. Positive versus negative.
Right. Positive atheism, sometimes called strong or hard atheism, is the definite assertion. Gods do not exist.
So taking a firm stance.
Yes. People like Anthony Flew, Michael Martin are often linked with this. It's an active belief that there are no gods.
Got it. And negative atheism.
Negative atheism, or weak soft atheism, is basically everyone else who isn't a theist but doesn't make that positive claim that gods don't exist.
So if you don't believe but you're not saying it's impossible, you fall there.
Pretty much. Michael Martin even argues that agnosticism, saying we can't know if God exists, actually counts as negative atheism.
Ah, but that's debatable, isn't it? Many agnostics would say I don't know is different from I don't believe.
It is debatable, yeah. That distinction is important for a lot of people. It's subtle.
And Richard Dawkins tried to map this out with his probability spectrum, right?
He did. Imagine a scale from 100% certainty God exists down to 100% certainty God doesn't exist, with all the shades of agnosticism in between.
That's helpful. Now, here's a really interesting idea. Sam Harris arguing the word atheism shouldn't even exist.
Yeah, that's a provocative take. He uses that analogy, doesn't he? Yeah. We don't call ourselves non-astrologers or non-alchemists.
Right.
His point is basically that not believing something when there's no good evidence is just the default rational position. It shouldn't need a special label.
That really flips the perspective, doesn't it? Instead of atheism needing justification, the burden of proof is on the person making the positive claim, the theist.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've got a much clearer picture of the definitions. Let's do that historical journey now. Where do these ideas start? The text mentions classical antiquity and early India.
That's right. Atheism, as we might think of it today, wasn't, widespread way back then, but questioning traditional beliefs, developing non-theistic ways of seeing the world. That is a long history.
But it dipped in the West for a while.
Yeah, our source notes that with the rise of Christianity, openly atheistic views really declined in the Western world. Which makes sense, given the dominance of the church.
Until the 16th century and the Enlightenment, that's when things picked up again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Key periods for resurgence. And by the 20th century, atheism was a pretty significant global viewpoint. But let's start back in India. What did non-belief look like there?
Yeah, what were those early roots?
Well, the text points to atheistic schools within early Indian thought, going way back to the Vedic period.
Really? That early?
Yeah. Among the traditional Hindu schools, Sankhya and early Mimamsa didn't accept a personal god, but the most explicitly anti-theistic one was probably the Charvaka school, around the 6th century BCE.
Charvaka? What were they about?
They were materialists, rejected religious texts, very focused on the observable world. Pretty radical for the time.
Sounds like it. How much do we know about them?
Well, interestingly, a lot of what we know comes from criticisms by other schools. Scholars like Chatterjee and Data point this out. It seems their own writings didn't really survive much.
Ah, so we see them through their opponents' eyes, partly.
To some degree, yes, but they were clearly influential enough to be debated. And it's also worth noting, Jainism and Buddhism rejected a personal creator god, which is a big departure from many theistic traditions.
Okay, so let's hop over to classical antiquity in the West. What was happening there?
Again, the roots are in pre-Socratic Greek philosophy, but our source says outright atheism, like we define it now, was pretty rare.
So more questioning than outright denial.
Often, yeah. You had thinkers like Democritus and the atomists explaining the universe with matter and chance. They saw religion as a human reaction to nature, but didn't explicitly deny gods existed.
But some people definitely crossed lines, didn't they? Anaxagoras.
Oh, absolutely. He got called the atheist by some, like Irenaeus, just for saying the sun was a fiery rock.
Because that challenged the idea of divine celestial bodies.
Exactly. Then there was Diagoras of Melos in the 5th century BCE, sentenced to death for mocking religious mysteries.
Wow.
Scholars still debate his exact views, but he was definitely seen as rejecting the gods. Some link him to the problem of evil, like the historian Whitmarsh mentions.
We'll come back to that problem of evil. What about Protagoras? He was more skeptical.
Very much so. He famously said, concerning the gods, I am unable to discover whether they exist or not.
Citing the obscurity of the subject and the shortness of life.
Sounds pretty agnostic.
Leans that way, definitely. Acknowledging the limits of human knowledge.
And Socrates. He got into trouble related to the gods, too.
He did. Aristophanes' play The Clouds painted him as teaching that the traditional gods didn't exist. And later, his trial. Part of the accusation was not believing in the state gods.
Did he deny being an atheist? He denied it at his trial, yes. But the historian Sedley suggests there might have been this sort of atheist underground in Athens, a growing skepticism.
So questioning was definitely happening, even if not always loudly proclaimed. What about later, in the Hellenistic period? Epicurus.
Ah, yes, Epicurus. Building on the atomists, he developed this whole materialistic philosophy. Universe governed by natural laws, no divine interference.
Did he deny gods existed?
Not entirely, no. He thought they might exist, but they were distant. Totally unconcerned with humans. The goal for Epicureans was ataraxia, peace of mind. And realizing you didn't need to fear divine punishment was key to that.
So gods are there, but they don't care.
Interesting. And Euhemerus had a different take.
Yeah, Euhemerus suggested the gods were originally just human rulers or heroes who got deified over time.
A human origin story for gods. Exactly. Not strictly atheist, but Plutarch criticized it for undermining belief, basically spreading atheism. And you had others like Theodorus Cyrenaica and Strato of Lampsacus, who were apparently more direct in denying gods. Sextus Empiricus later compiled arguments against the gods, too.
It sounds like the label atheist itself was a bit slippery. The text mentions early Christians being called atheists.
That's a crucial point for historical context, yeah. Romans and Greeks called Christians atheists because they didn't believe in the traditional Greco-Roman gods. It was basically an insult from the dominant culture.
Okay, fast forward. Early Middle Ages, Renaissance in Europe. What's the climate for atheistic ideas, then?
In Europe, during the early Middle Ages, openly atheistic views were very rare. The church's influence was just too strong.
Makes sense.
But interestingly, during the Islamic Golden Age, you had rationalist skeptics like al-Warraq, Ibn al-Rawandi, al-Razi, questioning religious dogma. And some were really outspoken, like the poet al-Mari. He called religion a fable invented by the ancients.
Wow. Did their work survive?
Sadly, not much of it. But back in Europe, even with the Inquisition, you had some unconventional ideas about God floating around, like with William of Ockham.
And the Renaissance, did that change things?
It definitely helped create more space for free thought and skepticism. You see it in figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, Montaigne, Rabelais, maybe not outright atheists, but certainly critical of religious institutions and dogmas.
And then the early modern period seems like a real turning point.
Absolutely. The Reformation, by challenging the Catholic Church, kind of unintentionally opened the door to questioning other religious authorities too. That's Blaney's point.
And deism became influential.
Yes, emphasizing reason and a more distant creator. But you also had outright persecution. Etienne Dolet was executed for atheism in the mid-16th century.
Grimm and Spinoza, he's often mentioned.
Spinoza's huge, 17th century. His philosophy essentially identified God with nature and its laws. Blaney calls him a semi-atheist. Very influential.
And we start seeing people actually calling themselves atheists.
Yes. Matthias Knudsen, 1674, is considered the first known person to explicitly do so. Then you get Kazimierz Ischicki in Poland, Jean Meslier in France, both writing against God's existence.
And the 18th century really kicked it up a notch.
Oh, yeah. Especially in France with Baron de Holbach. His system of nature was a frontal assault on religion, and other materialists like Naigeon. Even in Britain, Hammond and Turner were openly defending atheism.
Even Voltaire, though not fully atheist, had that famous line, "If God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him." Shows a sort of pragmatic view, maybe.
Right. Suggests religion has a social function, perhaps. And you absolutely have to mention Hume and Kant.
How do they fit in?
Hume's skepticism about what we can truly know and Kant's critique of metaphysical arguments, they really undermine the traditional philosophical proofs for God.
Shaking the foundations.
Definitely. And the French Revolution, with its anti-clerical phases and things like the cult of the supreme being, a very complex relationship with religion.
Okay, moving into the 19th century. Lots of change then.
Huge changes. Atheism really gained ground. You have Feuerbach arguing God is a human projection.
Wish fulfillment, basically.
Kind of, yeah. Projecting human ideals. Then Marx and Engels, famously seeing religion as a tool of social control, the opium of the people.
We'll come back to that quote.
And Bakunin, the anarchist, argued that the idea of God requires giving up reason, so you have to abolish God for human freedom.
Powerful stuff. And George Holyoake, he coined secularism.
Yes, after being imprisoned for atheism in Britain, apparently the last person to be, he wanted a term focused on improving this life, separate from religious questions.
And the 20th century, atheism becomes much more mainstream in many places.
Hugely so. It found a place in Marxism, logical positivism, existentialism, humanism, feminism, science.
So intertwined with many major movements.
Absolutely. Naturalists like Bertrand Russell and John Dewey rejected God. Analytical philosophers like Finley and Smart argued against God's existence. Smart even talked about agnostic atheists.
And then there was state atheism.
Right. Soviet Union, Communist China, actively anti-religious policies trying to suppress or eliminate religious practice. Lenin, Stalin, Mao.
A very different expression of atheism.
Very different. Though Stalin did ease up a bit during WWII for national unity. But you had things like the League of Militant Atheists in the USSR.
And that 1966 Time magazine cover, Is God Dead? That must have reflected a shift.
It really captured a moment of widespread questioning in the West. And you had figures like Periyar Ramaswamy fighting Hinduism in India, Vashti McCollum winning a Supreme Court case against religious instruction in U.S. schools.
And Madeleine Murray O'Hare.
Very influential in the U.S., especially with the Supreme Court case banning compulsory prayer in schools. And the Freedom from Religion Foundation started around then, too.
Which brings us almost up to date to the 21st century and new atheism.
Yeah, people like Harris, Dennett, Dawkins, Hitchens, Stanger. They took a much more assertive stance.
How so?
Arguing that religion isn't just wrong, it's actively harmful and should be countered, challenged with reason and evidence, not just tolerated.
And things like 9/11 and the creationism debates kind of fueled this.
Often cited as catalysts, yeah. They saw these as reasons why religious belief needed direct opposition.
And there have even been global atheist conventions.
A few, yeah. In Melbourne. Shows a growing sense of community organization. Okay, so that's the whirlwind history. Now, what about the arguments behind atheism? The intellectual toolkit.
Right, let's get into the philosophy. Epistemological arguments first. About knowledge.
Yep. Skepticism, like Hume's, says certainty about metaphysical things, including God, is impossible. He called it sophistry and illusion.
Pretty dismissive.
Yeah. Michael Martin, though, argues atheism can be a justified rational belief based on evidence and reason, mid-level principles, he calls them.
And then there's theological non-cognitivism. That sounds complicated.
It's the idea that the statement God exists is actually meaningless. It doesn't convey any real information, so it can't be true or false.
So it's not even wrong, it's just gibberish.
Essentially, yeah. Thinkers like A.J. Ayer argued this. Drange puts it outside these theism, agnosticism categories entirely.
Interesting. Okay, what about ontological arguments? About the nature of reality?
This often comes down to materialism or physicalism, the idea that reality is fundamentally physical matter and energy.
So no room for non-physical gods.
Exactly. Naturalism is closely related. Everything is fundamentally natural, explained by science and physical laws. No need for the supernatural. The Phil Papers survey Oppie mentions shows these views are pretty common among philosophers today.
And if nature is all there is, a supernatural creator isn't needed. The text mentions direct versus indirect arguments.
Yeah, direct arguments try to disprove God directly, maybe pointing out contradictions. Indirect arguments try to build a worldview, like naturalism, that just makes theism unnecessary or incompatible.
So arguing for naturalism is an indirect argument for atheism.
Right. Oppie thinks strong naturalism favors atheism, and he sees the problem of evil and contradictions in God's supposed attributes as the best direct arguments.
Okay, let's talk logical arguments. Those contradictions in God's attributes.
Yeah, like how can a being be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good simultaneously? Especially when you look at the world. Theidation atheism focuses specifically on that conflict between an all-good God and the existence of evil and suffering.
The problem of evil again. It keeps coming up. Epicurus' formulation was classic, wasn't it?
The one Hume quoted, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent."
It really puts the dilemma sharply.
It does, and similar arguments pop up in Buddhist philosophy too. It's a persistent challenge for theism.
Beyond pure logic, atheism also uses secular explanations for religion itself, right?
Definitely. Feuerbach and Freud saw God as a human invention, born from psychological needs, emotional comfort.
A projection, like we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Marx and Engels saw functionally religion as a tool for social control, keeping the oppressed in line.
The opium of the people.
That's the one. And Bakunin, again, saw the idea of God as inherently enslaving, requiring the surrender of reason, so it had to be abolished.
Quite the reversal of Voltaire's idea about needing to invent God.
Completely. It highlights just how differently they view religion's role and value.
Okay, let's tackle ethics. Can you be good without God? That's a common question.
A central one. The text talks about secular ethics, the idea that morality can exist and be justified without religion or divine commands.
Is there evidence for that?
Well, Zuckerman's research suggests correlations between societal well-being and lower religiosity in some places. He also found U.S. atheists tended to be less nationalistic, prejudiced, authoritarian.
Interesting. And atheists often see their own view as more moral?
Baker and Smith found that, yeah. But the counter-argument persists. Without God, isn't morality just subjective? Meaningless. Pascal worried about that.
Right, the moral relativism charge.
But the text pushes back. It mentions the no atheists in foxholes idea.
No.
Maybe people act morally regardless of belief in crisis. And then there's Plato's Euthyphro dilemma.
Remind us of that one.
Is something good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's inherently good?
Right. If it's good because God commands it, it seems arbitrary. If God commands it because it's already good, then God isn't the source of goodness.
Exactly. It questions whether God is even necessary for morality's foundation. Atheists argue you don't need a divine lawmaker for laws or ethics.
And just following divine orders, is that really morality?
Neiman and Baghini argue it's more like blind obedience.
Yeah.
Baghini even thinks atheism is a superior basis for ethics because it lets us rationally evaluate moral claims, including religious ones.
So different grounding, not necessarily no grounding. Atheism often involves criticizing religion too, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. Many prominent atheists, Hitchens, Dawkins, Russell, Ingersoll, Voltaire, Saramago, have been very critical of religious doctrines and practices.
Marx's opium of the people fits here.
Perfectly. Sam Harris argues relying on divine authority leads to dogmatism, authoritarianism. Studies do show links between fundamentalism and prejudice.
And critics point to historical events, crusades, inquisitions, terrorism, as arguments against religion's benefits.
Yes, those are often raised.
Yeah.
Of course, the counter is atrocities under atheistic regimes like the Soviet Union.
How do atheists usually respond to that?
People like Harris and Dawkins argue those regimes were driven by totalitarian ideologies, like Marxism-Leninism, which happened to be atheistic, but the atrocities weren't committed because of atheism itself or in its name. in the way religious violence often is.
So the motivation is the key difference they point to.
That's the argument, yeah.
Finally, the text notes, atheism isn't always totally separate from religion or spirituality.
Right. It's not always mutually exclusive. You can find atheists within some neo-pagan groups or identifying with humanistic Judaism or even as Christian atheists.
Really? Christian atheists?
Yeah, focusing on the moral teachings of Jesus without the divinity. And some forms of Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism definitely accommodate atheistic views.
So it's a complex landscape. Okay, let's shift to demographics. How many atheists are there? Is it hard to count?
Very hard. Definitions vary wildly in polls. A 2010 Encyclopedia Britannica estimate put the non-religious at about 9.6% globally, and atheists specifically at 2.0%.
Only 2%? That seems low.
It does, but definitions matter. They also noted numbers might be declining slightly due to lower birth rates in less religious countries, but other polls show higher numbers.
Like the Wynne Gallup ones?
Yeah, their 2012 poll found 13% globally identified as convinced atheists, though that number fluctuated in later surveys. China, Japan, Czech Republic often top those lists.
And East Germany and the Czech Republic came out high in another study.
Yes, a NORC study highlighted them. There seems to be a general correlation between atheism and societal security, economic development, social safety nets.
So not always.
Not always, there are exceptions, but it's a trend. In Europe, the 2010 Eurobarometer showed big differences. France, Czech Republic, Sweden had high rates of disbelief in God or life force.
And a 2012 Q study found only Czech Republic and Estonia had a majority unaffiliated in Europe.
That's right. In Asia, though, several places had majorities unaffiliated. North Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, China, per that same Pew study.
What about Australia and New Zealand?
Both have seen big increases in people reporting no religion in their censuses. Significant jumps.
And the U.S., we hear a lot about the rise of the nuns.
Yes, the religiously unaffiliated have grown substantially. Atheists are a part of that group, but still a minority within it. Some surveys suggest the actual atheist percentage hasn't changed dramatically in recent decades, even as the nuns grew.
It's complicated. The text even mentions the Arab world.
Yeah, atheism is becoming more visible there, though it's still very difficult and risky in many places. Small percentages identify as convinced atheists in some polls, and there's some organization in cities like Cairo, but social acceptance is generally very low.
Which brings us to attitudes towards atheism. Generally not great.
Globally, often not. There's research showing an implicit bias, linking atheism with immorality, even among people who are otherwise tolerant.
That Pew finding about needing God for morality.
Right? Many people worldwide still believe that. And U.S. polls consistently show atheists getting low-feeling thermometer ratings. There was even a study suggesting religious students viewed atheists more negatively after thinking about death.
That's concerning. Okay, what about links to wealth, education, IQ, reasoning styles?
This is fascinating. Studies often find positive correlations. Higher education, higher income, higher measured IQ are all linked, statistically, with a greater likelihood of being an atheist.
Higher IQ means more likely to be atheist.
There's a correlation, yes. A 2008 study found it across Europe and the U.S. Nigel Barber theorized that economic security in social democracies reduces the need for religious comfort.
But the text says the link isn't that strong and the reasons aren't totally clear.
Exactly. It's statistically significant, but not huge. Hypotheses include nonconformity among brighter people, or maybe a more analytical reasoning style, leading people to question religion.
Analytical reasoning, tell me more.
Several recent studies found atheists tend to score higher on cognitive reflection tests. These tests measure your ability to override gut feelings and think more deliberately.
So atheists are more likely to stop and think rather than go with intuition?
That's the idea behind the analytic atheist effect. It's even been found among philosophers. Though, importantly, these effects aren't seen consistently in all countries. Culture plays a big role.
And gender might be involved too?
Potentially. Men are more likely to be atheists and sometimes score higher on these tests, so it's complex. Things like math anxiety could even play a role.
Wow. Okay, we have definitely covered a lot of ground here. A real deep dive into atheism, its definitions, its long history, the arguments, the demographics, the attitudes.
We've seen it's not monolithic, right? It's a spectrum influenced by history, philosophy, society.
Absolutely. It's much more nuanced than just a lack of belief.
Definitely.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe something for you, the listener, to think about is that constant interplay between belief and non-belief. How has it shaped individuals and societies? And how might the different ways we define and argue about atheism affect our conversations about meaning, morals, and reality today?
A lot to chew on there.
For sure. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
The VirtualBooks publishing team thanks for your visit. If you liked our channel, please subscribe and share.